Welcome everyone to the Korea Society. I'm Tom Byrne, the president of the Korea Society, and with us tonight is Priscilla Moriuchi, and she's the director of strategic threat development at Recorded Future. This is actually the first public event that we've had in a series of North Korea cyber threat, cybersecurity programs. Priscilla has done a podcast for us, at least one podcast several months ago. And surreptitiously, we've also had private roundtables here about North Korea cybersecurity threat. But this is the first time we've had a public event. And of course, it comes at a time when North Korea, at least at the top level, seems to be changing with its engagement with South Korea, the Panmunjom Declaration, the summits, two summits with China, one in Dalian with President Xi Jinping, and one in Beijing, and the upcoming summit with President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un that evidently will be held in Singapore on June 12th. So at one level, things seem to be changing, but I think tonight or this evening, Priscilla will show that at another level, probably a more fundamental level, North Korea remains North Korea. And it's not that things aren't changing, they're adapting, but basically the basic element or the basic structure is the same. So I'll hand over the floor to Priscilla. Priscilla will give a brief talk. I'll go to some questions I've prepared for Priscilla, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. I should say that the audience Q&A will be off the record, and the part that we will record for broadcast is Priscilla's the introductory words that she'll make and the moderated Q&A. So Priscilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you again to the Korea Society for having me, and thank you all for coming tonight. So I wanted to start us off by just going through a brief presentation. There we go. To kind of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when I'm talking about North Korean cyber activity. So we'll go through a bit on North Korean intel and cyber organizations, their mission, right? Some historic and then some recent cyber ops and cyber activity, and then kind of get into later what I'll talk about a bit more with Tom, some of the research that we've done surrounding leadership activity online, their internet browsing behavior, and some of the things that we've learned from that type of activity. So I won't insult your intelligence by going much further into this, but I think we all sort of have the basic premise on what the DPRK is, to stand for, who they're led by, and kind of the basic, fundamentals of the organization, right? The Workers' Party and the KPA. When it comes to cyber operations, what we believe, from the outside, of course, is that the Reconnaissance General Bureau, also called the RGB, is really the center of cyber operations staffing, funding, recruitment, and tasking. So this is kind of a brief outline from an excellent CSIS report from 2015 that chronicled just the really broad mission of the RGB, everything that they have taken on, right, from everything from kind of special operations and commando raids to what we would consider terrorist attacks to cyber operations. Next is sort of my own kind of hacked together org chart from kind of what little intelligence we have on RGB. Again, it was formed in 2009 from a major restructure of the existing kind of disparate intelligence apparatus. So there were a number of different organizations with cover terms such as rooms or offices, separate bureaus, right? And if you kind of look at the structure of the RGB, it has a much broader intelligence remit and responsibility than most of its partner services around the world. And that's something to keep in mind when we try to put North Korean cyber activity in context. Especially because some of the operations that North Korea would conduct, other nation states would not, right? They might consider a red line. So again, a little bit on the background to give a sense of why cyber operations make sense for North Korea and why they're kind of doing what they're doing. So these are a number of operations that were run by the predecessor organizations of the RGB. These are quite famous in that they were essentially assassination attempts or bombings, terrorist attacks, realistically, that were perpetrated by North Korea and the predecessor organizations of the RGB. It was the first one at top is the assassination attempt, otherwise known as the Blue House raid in 1968, when North Korea sent a series of commandos right down across the DMZ into Seoul in an attempt to assassinate the then president in his home. The attempt was unsuccessful. There ended up being a gun battle in the street, and there was one operative who was killed. Right, that operative was kind of broadcast on television and said that he was sent to cut the president's throat. Second, a sort of series of bombings that took place in the 80s. Again, one in Rangoon, Burma, and another Korean Air Flight 858 before the Seoul Olympics in 1988. Again, these are operations from an intelligence perspective that most pure intelligence organizations would not take on. These are military, right, special operations that most other countries would consider part of a military campaign, but in North Korea, they're part of what's now their intelligence service. And moving on, another part to sort of the North Korean model, right, that's different than most other nations is this state-administered criminal system, right? The state itself sponsors and is involved in manufacture and smuggling of drugs, right, illicit drugs and narcotics, counterfeiting of various things, cigarettes, US dollars, and these destructive cyber attacks. I think there are studies that show that at least the criminal aspect between the drug smuggling and the counterfeiting could bring in as much as $500 million to $1 billion per year. Right? And that's just, that's not even considering the cyber attacks or any of the other funding. So I think next it's important to kind of get a little bit into the history of North Korean cyber activity and go through a few operations that were kind of viewed, at least in the West anyway, as either an eye-opener, right, or as pivotal for our knowledge of North Korean capabilities and kind of demonstrates how they have evolved over time. So in the West, at least, one of the first North Korean cyber operations that really caught our attention was, of course, the July 4th, 2009 denial of service attack against U.S. and South Korean government and commercial sites. The denial of service act itself wasn't crippling. It was more of the intent behind the attack, that North Korea was willing to attempt to disrupt the operations and of U.S. government departments, financial sector, and for those of us in intelligence community at the time, I was part of this lovely precedent of North Korea conducting cyber attacks or testing missiles on U.S. national holidays, which meant we all had to work. The next sort of set of operations in sort of the history of North Korean cyber ops is the 10 Days of Rain denial of service attacks. Those took place in 2011. What was interesting about those attacks, again, it was not necessarily the scale, right? There were denial of service attacks against South Korean websites, but that the bots that were co-opted in this attack, for example, they were set to time out, and the attacks were set to time out after 10 days, and the programs on the machines were set to overwrite the master boot record on the computers. And what that essentially does is it renders the machines unusable. So these are 30 to 40,000 sort of innocent people or computers, you could say, whose machines, were co-opted and ended up being destroyed. by North Korea during that attack. Next one was called sort of the Dark Soul attack. Occurred in 2013. It's a series of destructive attacks on South Korean banking and media sectors. That little skull graphic on the bottom is the message that popped up on the screens at a number of South Korean institutions, telling them, this is the beginning of the attack. We are the Who Is team. This was a North Korean operation. And then again, at the end of 2014, I think most of you will have pretty decent knowledge on the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment. For those of us, at least in the United States at the time, the Sony Pictures Entertainment attack was game-changing for us because it demonstrated, one, that North Korea was willing to attack a United States business and not only disrupt their operations, but destroy information. They were willing to release information, right, that would destroy the reputation of people, individuals, and that company broadly. And also that there was a destructive element against a corporation, right, which had not really been, at least for the West anyway, in the United States, been encountered before. That sort of period in time from 2009 to 2014 was probably what I would consider the first phase of North Korean cyber activity. Most of those operations were designed to either disrupt normal business activities in the United States or South Korea, disrupt operations on Korean Peninsula by defense contractors or government, send a message, cause chaos, those type of things. This is not to say that those operations are not ongoing today, but that from about 2015 onwards, we've entered a phase where the most important imperative for cyber operations in the past few years is revenue generation. We'll go through the banking operations, the WannaCry attack that occurred in last May, and then North Korea's interest in cryptocurrency, real briefly. So we've got a series here of known or suspected banking operations that North Korea has been involved in. Again, these are known or suspected. On the next two slides, I've got 11. They're anywhere from, I would say, 10 to 30 known or suspected North Korean banking operations. These are the ones where that I've compiled that have higher confidence, but again, they have not all been confirmed. The first probable operation occurs all the way back in January 2015 against a bank in Ecuador called Banco del Astro. We have a lot of information on this attack because the bank has sought to obtain or reobtain some of the funds that were lost through the court system, mainly the court system in Hong Kong. And they've had to reveal a lot about how the attack was executed, right, where the funds were sent, right, what how the SWIFT system or how the attackers got around, right, the SWIFT protocols. And so that's really from an attribution perspective, one of the first operations that we can kind of have at least a moderate confidence North Korea was involved. And then you kind of go through and you see that there are at least two others against a Philippine bank and a Vietnamese bank through the end of 2015. And then again, this sort of infamous Bank of Bangladesh operation in February 2016. And then, February or 2016, there are about 3 or 4 operations. That again through 2017, and then as late as March, there's another attack on a Turkish bank. So one of the interesting things about North Korean SWIFT operations, there's a lot of misunderstanding about when people talk about the SWIFT system. So first off is North Korea has not exploited the SWIFT system, right? All of these operations entail gaining access to a server which administers the SWIFT computing messages, right? So that's first. Second, these attackers are incredibly knowledgeable about the SWIFT system. In the Bank of Bangladesh attack, for example, the attackers were able to install their own update of the SWIFT software, which disabled the security protocols. and enabled them to execute the fraudulent transactions. That type of knowledge takes a lot of study and understanding, and these are not operations that are just kind of executed off the cuff, right? They're well planned. They're not always successful in the sense that we don't know that the attackers end up retrieving a large amount of money, or that the money is able to get back to Korea in the form of hard currency, North Korea. But again, these operations are well thought out and are at the higher end, right, of the capability spectrum. I like to go through the WannaCry attack because it's a really interesting, almost like case study. It leads us well into sort of how North Korea's interest in cryptocurrency has really evolved over the past year. As you can kind of see from the first bullet, the US and the UK and quite a few private sector organizations have attributed that attack to North Korea. Tom Bossert's statement in the US government believes that it was meant to cause chaos, right? Havoc and destruction. It was not meant as a fundraising mechanism. And it just depends on what you believe their goal was. In the end, it only generated about 52 Bitcoin, the entire attack. So it essentially took out much of the global commercial world. And people were quite fearful for about 3 days in mid-May of last year. Individual users as well as companies were paying ransom for computers that would never be restored, right? Because the encryption keys were the domain and the callback were disabled. So I bring up this case because it's to date the only real example we have of known North Korean activity utilizing and how they're utilizing cryptocurrency. So in this case, it was Bitcoin, right? So the WannaCry ransom, right, was deposited in 3 wallets. They requested Bitcoin. That was back in May. They had 52. Those Bitcoin and those wallets sat for months until August 2nd of 2017, when all 3 wallets were emptied in 2 separate transaction each. So a total of 6 transactions, all within a few minutes of each other. At that point, all 6 of those transactions were moved through what's called a mixer. A cryptocurrency mixer is essentially like a launderer, right? It essentially breaks up all of the coins into very, very tiny bits and engages in tens of thousands of transactions to essentially mask, right, the coins that went in from the coins that come out. So in this case, this mixer that was used was called Shapeshift. It's here in the United States, run by a United States company. After that mixing transaction, so for example, I tried to trace that mixer, I got to 40,000 transactions, right, before I just timed out. Even through a mixer, which uses, different mixers have different algorithms, right? Even for a currency like Bitcoin that is not truly anonymous, right? Mixing alone virtually anonymizes the end user. The North Koreans in this case went a step further by then converting their Bitcoin to Monero. Monero is the second cryptocurrency in which each transaction itself is encrypted from the outside so that only the sender and the user can ever see each other or how many coins were actually transferred. So if you look at the Monero blockchain, it's just kind of a series of encrypted transactions. And that's where the trail goes cold. We do not know what happened to the Monero. We do not know, how it was moved, if they cashed out, if they were able to purchase anything with the Monero. And that leads kind of into this third realm of operations that really peaked last year, and that's thefts from primarily South Korean, at this point, cryptocurrency exchanges. They began in February of last year. And as you can see, it just cascaded throughout the year. There were a number of successful thefts, a number of attempts, a series of spear phishing campaigns in the summer and again in the fall. We've also seen, at least from our research, North Korea conducting their own cryptocurrency mining activities, Bitcoin mining that started at least as early as May, Monero mining, which started at least as early as November. And from our calculations at just the base level, if you take the coins, and these are only Bitcoin, that we know North Korea has stolen. So we know in total from the February and the April thefts that North Korea has at the very minimum 11,000 Bitcoin. Right. So at the time of the thefts in April and May of last year, those 11,000 Bitcoin, or 1150 if you take the WannaCry, were worth around $15 million. Right. If North Korea wanted to speculate, right, and retained their Bitcoin and waited for a time in which the value was greater, say mid-December at peak, those same coins could have been worth as much as $220 million, just 11,000 coins. And that's the very bottom level that we actually assessed that they possessed at that time. So I think the point there is that we can sort of see, especially the cryptocurrency operations, as kind of a side show, right? Because the exchanges and cryptocurrency themselves are largely outside of the financial regulatory system. Some people use them, most people don't. But for North Korea, our assessment is that these are actually really meaningful and valuable operations for them. And that's the reason why they're occurring. So I think that's kind of the end. And then just to kind of close everything up. From my perspective, cyber operations fit very nicely into North Korea's asymmetric warfare strategy, right? It helps them compensate for these conventional national power deficit, right? They don't have the typical hard power, like a capable, right, and effective military. They don't have a large economy. They don't have appealing soft power. And so in this case, they've had to choose tactics and methods, right, that will allow them to level the playing field. And utilizing the internet and cyber operations are one of the ways that they've chosen to try to level the playing field. Of course, the nuclear and ballistic missile program is another one. So that's kind of it for me. I'll wrap that one up there. And then we can kind of continue with the discussion.
Okay. Well, thank you, Priscilla. Before I get into a couple of questions about your topic directly, could you tell us something about Recorded Future? What is this organization? When was it founded? And do you do anything else but look at North Korea?
Yeah. There's only one of us. That's me, who looks at North Korea. So Recorded Future is a cyber or a threat intelligence company, right? We specialize in essentially cyber threat intelligence, but we collect basically open source information from all parts of the internet. So what would consider to be open internet, like news sources, to closed access forums, to criminal dark web underground sites. We kind of process it all through our machine learning. We translate it, we entitize it, and we make it searchable. So it's basically just like, really an open source SIGINT system, more or less.
Okay, good, thanks. I noticed that the WannaCry attack, I even heard of that one, occurred last year, right, in 2017. So this year, North Korea is taking at least the leadership has taken a dramatic turn. A change in its position, willing to engage with the South. It had the summit back on the 27th of April. And North Korea has said it's willing to denuclearize, assuming that means give up its nuclear weapons and maybe its missiles too. Is there any indication that North Korea's behavior, or the behavior attributed to North Korea with the cyber threats, has changed in recent months?
No. I think it's sort of a question of like what the data says versus what the diplomats say, right? In the case of North Korean cyber operations, and even like the research we've done on leadership internet activity, for example, like last summer we did a study of North Korean leadership browsing, right? The type of things that they do online, just to get a sense of how aware North Korean leaders were of contemporary internet society. And what we found was that they were really plugged in. They used things like Facebook and Instagram every day. They're streaming video, they're playing games. Most of their activity was very open. It was sort of like less than 1% they even utilized any kind of anonymization service or anything. And it was quite normal to most of us. In the 6 months since that, so from July through when we re-examined their browsing behavior, they changed completely. They increased their use of anonymization protocols by 12,000% in 6 months, which is a substantial increase. They completely abandoned Western social media services like Facebook and Instagram that had been their favorites just 6 months before for their Chinese equivalents. And from what we see from the cyber operations, leadership browsing behavior, we see that North Korea is trying to hide itself more from the world and hide their intentions and their operations, not open themselves up, right? Increase transparency.
Right. I was intrigued by your those figures you had on the revenues that you estimate North Korea might have made through these hacking of banks and whatnot. One of the mysteries of North Korea, now that the sanctions have started to bite, I think, in North Korea this year. So exports. There's two types of trade from North Korea. That I will call it the visible and the invisible. The invisible could be the illegal stuff, illicit stuff, whatever. And trade by, I'm meaning basically foreign exchange flows with non-residents, offshore foreign exchange flows. So exports to China in the first quarter of this year have collapsed, down 80, 90%. Imports have not collapsed. They've gone down. So North Korea consistently through the years and through the first quarter can run, I think, basically on an annual basis about $1 billion trade deficit. And on its visible trade, mostly with China. And it seems that just this, your estimates of the hacking of the banks and maybe some other hacking of gaming operations and Bitcoin, they could close that gap, finance that gap just through these invisible or illicit activities. How confident are you in those numbers that you estimate?
So the numbers are at best an educated guess, right? For a number of reasons. So first off, with the like gaming hacks, right? We know from Defector and other interviews that there are North Korean cyber operators who work in third-party countries abroad and who have a mandate to earn a certain amount of money per year that goes back to the regime. In this case, or in most cases, the cyber operators accomplish this revenue goal by doing things like gaming hacks, reversing of gaming software, writing scripts that will allow players to kind of cheat, like in a poker game, right, to see your opponent's cards and sell those type of things, stealing armor or swords or outfits from the profiles of gamers, right, and reselling that stuff. Things that we might consider from a sophistication or technology perspective to be quite low level, and they are. But the return on them in terms of funds, right, is quite high. And so between that and the cryptocurrency ops, we don't know when they cash out, right? We don't know what you can buy. Like, you can take physical cash out of a cryptocurrency ATM, but can you buy things that North Korea would need, hard goods? Can you buy coal for Bitcoin? Maybe you can. I don't know. So we think the numbers come from what we estimate, at a moderate, right, with a low to moderate confidence, right, how much they would get from these apps.
And it seems to me that one of the features of the North Korea's cyber operations is that it does not operate within the jurisdiction of North Korea. These activities tend to be abroad. Which countries are the primary suspected sites of North Korean cyber activities?
Yeah, so we know that China, right, and the border region especially, is one area. We've heard defectors talk about India and Southeast Asia. We've seen similar patterns from our data, where we identify, significant numbers of North Koreans living in those countries. Defectors have also said that they've gone abroad and studied at universities in India and Southeast Asia, to cement their operational skills and their IT background. So it's quite a unique model, right? I mean, there are maybe some operations that are conducted from territory, but most are conducted from abroad.
Yeah.
In other countries.
Yeah. And I guess my last question is, we all know the most pressing issue between North Korea and the U.S. and South Korea and the other powers is the denuclearization. But at some point, assuming that relations do move in a normalizing direction between North Korea and South Korea, and I guess we all hope that that's where they go, and also with the U.S., how long can the negotiators in these countries ignore the North Korea cybersecurity operations? I understand that even when the U.S. Treasury Secretary and Trade Delegation went to Beijing last week, one of the items on the agenda was the Chinese government involvement in cyber operations. Is this something that can be indefinitely postponed, or is it from the risk perspective of American corporations or government or whatnot, or is it does it have some degree of urgency?
So I don't think it can be postponed forever for two primary reasons. One, American and Western companies are victimized, right? Money is stolen, right, from companies and consumers. People are defrauded, right? We're not really willing to tolerate that behavior from anyone, let alone North Korea. Two, they seem to be utilizing the internet as a quite effective way to circumvent some of the sort of extreme pressure, right, from the sanctions regime. And there's really has been no negative consequences for much of this behavior online. It's really just been positive outcomes for the Kim regime. So there would be no reason, even if, talks and the atmosphere with South Korea were to become more positive, for them to abandon these operations, because they likely pull in such a large amount of funding.
Well, that's a rather glum note to end on, when we're all, I think most of us at least, are very hopeful that the talks between North Korea and the U.S. move in a positive direction. Well, thank you all for coming here tonight, and thank you so much, Priscilla.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look forward to an update in the near future.
Let's be more optimistic. Thank you.